Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into Europe's reaction to President Trump's recent moves on the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's been a busy week for European leaders.
It really has. I mean, we've got all these sources. You gave me news articles, expert analysis, and it seems like everyone's on edge.
Well, it's understandable, right? The U.S., usually such a strong supporter of European security, seems to be shifting focus.
Yeah, and leaving their allies in a tough spot, it seems like. So, can you quickly walk us through, what exactly happened? What were the big events that kind of triggered this whole European response?
Yeah, sure. The main catalyst was really a two-pronged approach by the Trump administration.
Okay.
First, U.S. Defense Secretary Hegseth announced this shift in American security priorities away from Europe. And then, almost simultaneously, President Trump revealed his intentions to hold unilateral peace talks with Russia regarding Ukraine.
Unilateral meaning?
Meaning without Ukraine at the negotiating table.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a big deal. So no wonder European leaders are scrambling. I mean, there are probably a ton of questions swirling around right now.
Definitely.
And that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today.
Yeah.
Our goal is to really understand how European leaders are reacting to all of this.
Right.
And what it means for the future of, European security as a whole.
Absolutely. We're going to delve into the different perspectives, the concerns, the potential consequences,
Right.
and really try to make sense of this whole thing.
Okay, great. So our sources describe these emergency summits in Paris right after the U.S. announcements.
Yeah.
I can only imagine the atmosphere in those rooms, tense, to say the least.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Can you paint us a picture of what was going on? What were the key issues that European leaders were grappling with during those meetings?
I think one of the most pressing concerns was the need for a unified response.
Right.
The situation really demanded Europe to present a strong and cohesive front, a demonstration of their agency.
Right.
In the face of all this, But achieving that unified response, well, it's no easy feat because Europe is a diverse continent, right?
Right.
Each nation has its own unique history, its own interests, and its own specific relationship with Russia. Trying to get everyone on the same page, especially when it comes to security, can feel like, herding cats.
So that's a great analogy. So amidst all of this talk about unity, what was the big question on everyone's mind?
I think the question that dominated the discussions was whether or not European nations should send troops to Ukraine as part of a potential peacekeeping force.
Okay.
It was a really, really divisive issue.
So some were ready to jump in and others were like, hold on a second.
Exactly.
What did our sources reveal about those different viewpoints?
Well, the UK, under Prime Minister Starmer, they expressed a willingness to commit troops, but with a critical condition, a U.S. security backstop.
Okay, break that down for me. What does a security backstop actually mean?
Basically, it's a guarantee from the U.S. to defend Europe if, things escalate.
Okay.
In case of any Russian aggression.
So it's like we're in, but only if you have our backs.
That's a good way to put it. But not everyone shared the UK's enthusiasm.
Yeah, makes sense. So who was a little more hesitant?
Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland were all a lot more cautious.
Interesting. So what were their reservations?
German Chancellor Scholz argued that sending troops at this point would be premature, suggesting that diplomacy and de-escalation should be the priority.
Right.
Italy echoed similar concerns, highlighting, the potential complexities of deploying troops.
Okay.
And maybe even questioning how effective it would actually be in this climate.
And what about Poland? Given their history with Russia, I'd think they'd be all for sending troops.
Surprisingly, Polish Prime Minister Tusk ruled out sending Polish troops, probably due to a mix of domestic political considerations and the risks involved,
Yeah, it's like everyone's playing a high-stakes game of chess, trying to figure out their next move.
Yeah.
But wait, wasn't there one country that seemed open to the idea, even without the U.S. backstop?
Ah, you're thinking of Sweden.
Yeah.
They indicated a willingness to send troops, but only after a fair and sustainable peace had been negotiated.
So they're kind of like, let's solve the problem first, then we'll talk troops.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so a lot of back and forth on the troops issue, but one thing everyone seemed to agree on was the need for Europe to increase its defense spending.
Yes, absolutely.
Everyone was on the same page with that one. Why was that such a unanimous concern? Did our sources shed any light on that?
Yeah, the sources repeatedly highlighted this growing sentiment that Europe needs to beef up its own defenses, and quickly. And this urgency stems from, the realization that the U.S. might be reducing its commitment to Europe's defense.
Right. It's like that moment when you realize you can't rely on mom and dad forever.
Haha, exactly. And that sentiment was echoed by a lot of leaders, but perhaps most forcefully by Polish Prime Minister Tusk. He issued this stark warning suggesting that failing to invest heavily in defense now could lead to much greater costs later.
Oof, that's scary.
Yeah, it's that ounce of prevention idea, but on a massive scale.
Okay, so we've got Europe potentially needing more troops, scrambling to increase defense budget, and in the meantime, President Trump is moving ahead with these controversial peace talks with Russia.
Right,
And, as we mentioned, Ukraine isn't even invited.
right.
What did our sources say about how European leaders are reacting to that?
A lot of anxiety surrounding these talks, especially the fear of being sidelined in negotiations that could reshape the continent's security.
Yeah, I bet.
European leaders feel like they deserve a seat at the table,
Right.
that their voices and interests need to be considered.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, and they're worried about a deal being struck that doesn't address their concerns, or, importantly, Ukraine's interests.
And speaking of Ukraine, how are they feeling about being left out of these discussions?
President Zelensky has been very clear. No deal without Ukraine's involvement.
Yeah,
He sees it as a matter of principle.
rightfully so.
I mean, a peace agreement that ignores the wishes of one of the key parties involved is unlikely to be sustainable or just, right?
Yeah, it's like trying to plan a surprise party for someone without asking them what kind of party they'd want.
Aha, exactly.
So we've got President Trump pushing for these talks, Europe feeling left out, and Ukraine standing firm,
It's complicated.
to say the least. But before we jump into the potential outcomes of these talks, I want to circle back to this idea of a U.S. backstop.
Yeah.
You mentioned it earlier regarding the UK's willingness to send troops, but why is this concept so important for other European leaders as well?
The backstop, at its core, is a security guarantee from the U.S.,
Okay,
a commitment to defend Europe if things get really bad.
right.
It provides a sense of reassurance, allowing European countries to feel more confident about taking a tougher stance against Russia, knowing they have the might of the U.S. military behind them.
It's like having a really strong friend who always has your back. It gives you the courage to stand up for yourself knowing you have backup if things go wrong.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And historically, this idea is rooted in NATO's Article 5,
Right.
which enshrined the principle of collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. And the U.S., with its military power, is seen as crucial for deterring Russian aggression and upholding that principle.
But with the U.S. signaling this potential shift in priorities, this security guarantee suddenly feels less certain, right?
That's the core issue. European leaders are now questioning whether they can still depend on the U.S. as their ultimate protector. And this uncertainty is fueling the debate about European defense spending and the need for the continent to become more self-reliant when it comes to security.
So if the U.S. is less willing to play the role of protector, does that mean Europe has to step up and fill the void?
That's the big question.
And how would they even do that?
It's a complex equation
Yeah.
involving military capabilities, economic resources, and political will.
It's a lot to think about, but let's bring it back down to earth for a second. We've talked about troops, budgets, these high-level talks, but what does all of this actually mean for the average person in Europe?
That's an important point to consider.
Yeah.
Security affects everything. It affects our freedom to travel, our ability to trade, even our sense of peace of mind at home.
Yeah.
When security is threatened, our way of life is threatened.
So it's not just like some abstract geopolitical game. It has real consequences for people.
Exactly, and the sources really highlight this sense of unease across the continent.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Europe is having to grapple with this new reality, where security can no longer be taken for granted.
Right. So what kind of choices are they facing now?
Well, for starters, how much are they willing to invest in their own defense?
Yeah.
We talked about those calls for increased defense spending.
Right.
That's not just talk. That means potentially higher taxes, more military equipment, maybe even mandatory military service in some countries.
Wow, those are some tough decisions. And then there's the whole question of NATO.
Right?
If the U.S. is stepping back, does that mean the alliance weakens?
It's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some analysts believe a less engaged U.S. could actually be the push Europe needs to become more integrated on defense.
Okay.
It could force them to pool resources, develop a more unified, independent defense posture.
So it's like a breakup that actually makes you stronger.
You could say that. But of course, others worry a weakened NATO leaves Europe vulnerable to Russian pressure,
Yeah.
which could potentially unravel decades of collective security.
It's definitely a balancing act. Let's go back to those peace talks for a moment.
Sure.
They're happening without Ukraine, which, again, seems pretty unfair.
Yeah.
What's the likely outcome here, and how could it actually impact the situation in Ukraine?
Predicting outcomes with President Trump is always a bit of a gamble.
To say the least.
But one thing that's clear from the sources is that any agreement reached without Ukraine's buy-in is unlikely to be successful. It could even make things worse,
Yeah.
escalate tensions rather than easing them.
Right. It's like forcing to puzzle pieces together that just don't fit.
Exactly. And President Zelensky has been firm on this point.
Right.
No deal without Ukraine at the table.
Hmm.
He understands that any agreement that compromises Ukraine's sovereignty
Yeah.
or territorial integrity would be a betrayal of his people and their sacrifices.
So even if Trump and Putin shake hands, it doesn't mean much without Ukraine's approval.
Pretty much. It really underscores a fundamental principle of international relations, right?
Hmm.
Lasting peace requires inclusive dialogue
Right.
and addressing everyone's concerns.
Which in this case means bringing Ukraine into the conversation about its own future. What about those countries open to sending peacekeeping troops?
Right.
If a deal is struck, could that mean European boots on the ground in Ukraine?
It's definitely possible.
Mm.
Both the UK and Sweden have indicated they'd be willing to consider it,
Okay.
but the details would really depend on the peace agreement itself.
Right.
And, crucially, what security guarantees are in place.
So we could see, like, European troops patrolling the streets of Ukraine, keeping the peace.
It would be a huge shift.
It really would.
It would be a historic development, really, with both risks and opportunities.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, what are some of those potential risks and opportunities?
On the one hand, it could signal a more assertive
Mm.
and independent European security posture.
Okay.
But on the other hand,
There's the risk of mission creep.
what does that mean?
You know, European forces getting entangled in a prolonged conflict.
Right.
Potentially even creating friction with Russia?
Yeah, I could see how that could happen. It seems like Europe is at a real crossroads here.
Definitely.
What are the key takeaways? What should our listener be thinking about as they navigate all of this? Well, the biggest takeaway, I think, is that the transatlantic relationship is changing.
Mm-hmm.
The old certainties are gone, and Europe is having to reevaluate its reliance on the U.S. for security.
It's like realizing your parents aren't invincible superheroes. They're just people trying their best.
That's a good way to put it. And this realization can be, both empowering and daunting,
Right.
but it's a necessary step towards maturity, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I agree. It's like Europe is going through this collective coming-of-age moment,
Exactly.
trying to figure out its own place in the world and how to stand on its own 2 feet. So what about the future of European security?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. Where do we go from here?
And like any big decision, there are pros and cons to each option.
Okay, so walk me through that. What are the potential benefits and drawbacks of each path?
Well, staying under the U.S. security umbrella, it offers familiarity
Mm-hmm.
and a sense of stability,
Right.
but it also means accepting the risk of, being tied to an increasingly unpredictable partner.
Yeah, I can see that. And what about going it alone? What are the potential upsides and downsides of a more independent Europe?
A more independent path would give Europe the ability to set its own security agenda
Okay.
and act more decisively on the world stage.
Hmm.
It could even strengthen unity and cooperation among European nations
I see.
as they realize they need to work together and pool resources.
So like a chance to spread their wings and really fly on their own.
Exactly. But of course, it's not without its challenges.
Yeah, what are some of those hurdles?
For one, a more independent Europe would need to spend a lot more on defense,
Hmm.
which could put a strain on budgets
Right.
and lead to some difficult political choices.
Yeah, I can see that. And then there's the whole issue of getting 27 countries with different histories and priorities to agree on a single defense strategy.
Right, that's no easy task.
So 2 paths, each with its own set of obstacles. Which direction do you think Europe will ultimately choose?
I don't think it'll be a clear-cut decision, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's likely going to be a gradual, messy process,
Hmm.
blending elements of both paths.
So not a complete break from the U.S., but more of a shift in the relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so a gradual recalibration. What are the key factors that will determine whether this recalibration is successful?
Well, first and foremost, can European nations overcome their historical divisions and work together effectively on defense?
That's a big one.
It is. Then there's the question of their commitment to increasing defense spending.
Right.
Are they actually willing to put their money where their mouth is?
Yeah, that's always a tough one. And finally, can they come up with a clear and consistent strategy for dealing with Russia?
Exactly, one that balances deterrence with dialogue.
It sounds like Europe has a lot on its plate.
They do, but challenges often breed innovation.
That's true.
This situation is forcing Europe to ask some hard questions and make tough choices about its future.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that through this process, Europe could come out stronger and more unified than before.
I like that. A bit of optimism. Okay, so we've talked about a lot today. Troop deployments, defense budgets, peace talks, the future of NATO, all in the context of this evolving relationship between Europe and the U.S. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about the importance of citizen engagement.
Yes,
Why is it so crucial for everyday people to be paying attention to all of this?
Because security isn't just something that governments or alliances provide.
Hmm.
It's a shared responsibility.
Okay.
Informed citizens, people who understand the issues and are willing to engage in constructive dialogue,
Yeah.
are crucial for shaping effective security policies.
So it's not just about leaving it to the politicians and the experts.
Exactly. The decisions made in those meetings have a direct impact on people's lives.
Right.
It's vital for citizens to make their voices heard,
Mm-hmm.
hold their leaders accountable,
Yeah.
and really contribute to the conversation about the future they want for their countries and for Europe as a whole.
So to our listener out there, we're urging you to stay informed, stay engaged, and don't be afraid to speak up.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Europe's security challenges.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been fascinating, a little bit unsettling at times, but definitely informative.
Agreed.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, thanks for taking the deep dive with us.